Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for our weekly Hanauma education program, Hanauma Talks. Today, we'll be featuring Jason Baker from the NOAA Hawaiian Monksy Research Program, and he'll be presenting today. Just a little side note, he actually pre-recorded this talk, so please save your guys' questions towards the end for our last 15-minute question and answer period. Jason is actually available online, but he will answer all your questions at the end of the talk. Okay, so I'm gonna share the presentation right now.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining in. My name is Jason Baker, and this week's topic is how reduced and degraded island habitat affects the long-term viability of the monk seal population at French Frigate Shoals. My co-authors are listed after my name, and we all contributed to a recent publication on this topic that you can download at the web address that's shown here. So this evening, I'm going to be referring to terrestrial habitat and at times marine habitats. Monk seals are really amphibious creatures, and they need both for different parts of their lives. But this talk is primarily going to be focused on the island habitat or the terrestrial habitat. And that means these small islands at French Frigate Shoals where the seals come out and do various things that they need to do. Here's a couple of photos on the right. There's Tern Island from the air, and this is the largest island at French Frigate Shoals, and it looks a little bit like an aircraft carrier, and that's by design, as you'll hear a little bit later. And on the left, this is a picture taken at Tern Island in the mid-1980s when the population of seals was much larger than it is today, and the beaches were somewhat crowded. If you have a sharp eye, you can find a glass ball also in that photograph. To orient you, here's a map of the Hawaiian archipelago showing the main Hawaiian islands at the lower right and the northwestern Hawaiian islands on the left, and French Frigate Shoals is circled in red. French Frigate is the largest atoll in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and is one of the closer of those islands to the main Hawaiian Islands, and it's about 570 miles from Hanauma Bay. And now this is a map of just French Frigate Shoals, and the blue shading shows the water depths down to about 30 meters. And so you can see that the atoll is enclosed by a barrier reef that's outlined here, and that's about 20 miles from north to south. And the little red marks on there are all the little islands that I'll be talking about today. I'm going to go through those quickly just so that you get oriented because I'll be mentioning them, at least some of them again. Shark Island is a small kind of coral rubble spit in the top left there, and then you move to the right and see Tern Island, which is the largest island, the one that looks like an aircraft carrier. Then there's Trig and Whaleskate. Those are somewhat larger islands. Round and Mullet were really small islands and are mostly gone most of the time. Bear Island doesn't really exist anymore. East Island was one of the larger islands. And then there is Gin and Little Gin, which are sand spits to the south. And then finally, at the very south is Disappearing Island, which is aptly named because it often emerges and submerges. Just to give you a better idea of what the islands actually look like, on the left there's a photo of a juvenile seal relaxing at Little Gin Island. In the center is an aerial shot taken from a drone of 3 seals relaxing on Round Island. And then to the right is a digital globe photo that I just downloaded today that was taken in May, and it shows the gins, Gin and Little Gin Island. Each of those are about 1,000 feet long. The monk seal population at French Frigate Shoals has a long and complex history. This plot shows the beach counts of seals over time. So we have years on the bottom on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the mean beach count for all of the main populations in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands that have been studied for decades. So it goes from French Frigate Shoals to Laysan, Lisiansky, Pearl and Hermes, Midway, and Curie, all color coded there, as noted on the right. And the salmon colored spots are French Frigate Shoals. And these beach counts are not really the total population abundance, but it's just a way to track the population by counting the seals that are on the beach at any given time. And this is only a portion of the population because there's usually 2 to 3 seals in the water for every one on land, but it does do a good job of sort of tracking the trends in seal abundance over time. The most notable thing that I want you to take home from this confusing graph is that for most of the subpopulations, they were at their peaks early on in the late 50s and early 60s, and they all were starting to decline at that time. On the other hand, French Frigate Shoals was quite a bit smaller at that time and then grew very rapidly, peaked in the late 1980s, and then just crashed, and now is down kind of in the cluster there with the other populations. While we don't know the reasons entirely for the boom and bust cycle of the monk seal population at French Frigate Shoals, we do have some ideas about what probably went on. So the plot on the right again shows the trend in the increase in the counts of seals, followed by a rapid decline after the late 1980s. And then along the bottom, there's a sort of timeline of various human activities that were going on during this same period. And that starts in the early 1930s with naval activities that were fairly sporadic up until World War II, when things really ramped up and Tern Island was in fact dredged and built up, and a seawall was built around it to make a landing strip and a naval air base, in fact. Then there was a fishery that operated into the late 1950s, and fish was flown out of French Frigate Shoals to be marketed in the main Hawaiian Islands. A lot of activity on land for that. And there was a Loran station at East Island, and that's depicted in the lower left photo, where a lot of East Island was covered with Quonset huts and other stuff, and seals were probably prohibited pretty much from having their pups and hanging out there. And eventually that switched from East Island to Tern Island. Loran, if you aren't familiar, is the old pre-GPS way that people used to navigate at sea by triangulating between these various stations that were located throughout the Pacific. So after the Loran station was moved to Tern Island and pretty much the human activity was concentrated at Tern Island, the population was released and started to grow pretty rapidly. What happened after that is unclear, if the population reached its carrying capacity or if there was a change in the prey availability, but for whatever reason, the young seals started to die, and they were really starving. They really couldn't find enough to eat. And so the loss of the young seals eventually translated into a population decline. And you'll see there's a mark in there saying 101 removals. What that indicates is that we had a seal rehabilitation program going on during that time, and the young seals that were starving were taken away, fed, and then released at other sites other than French Frigate Shoals, where they would have a better chance of surviving. And 101 seals were taken out during that time, and you might imagine that that contributed to this decline. It may have to some degree, but probably really not very much, because most of those seals that were taken away were thin and undersized weaned pups that were unlikely to have survived without that intervention. So while it may have reduced the population a little bit, the population was really crashing in any case. Okay, so a couple of really important points to keep in mind. So from the last slide, we know that there was a lot of human activity happening at French Frigate Shoals during the 20th century, and that probably suppressed the population for a long time because the seals just didn't have access to all the terrestrial habitat that was actually there because humans were occupying it. Once they were released from that burden, the population grew really rapidly, and then they reached a peak and then started to crash. But that crash was really related to something in the marine environment, as evidenced by the starving seals, rather than something to do with the terrestrial habitat. Okay, so now we're going to turn to focus specifically on the land habitat. And the first thing is a plot of changes in the amount of habitat over time. And our best information about that comes from just 3 time points, 1923, roughly 1963, and 2010. The salmon-colored bars show the area of each of the little islands at French Frigate Shoals in 1923, and that was reported by the Tanager expedition. I can't really vouch for how accurate those measurements are. They're all we have, so I did plot them. But the green and then the blue bars are really quite reliable measurements. And there's a couple of things to note here. Turn Island, which is the one on the far left, had a big jump between the 20s and 1963, and that just reflects turning Turn Island into a naval airstrip. The other thing to note is that from 1963 until 2010, when Michelle Reynolds and her colleagues at the USGS did a really accurate mapping of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, there was generally a drop in the amount of habitat at each one of these islands. Notably, Whaleskate Island, which just says submerged, was already gone by 2010, so there is no measurement there. But all of the other ones, you can pretty much see a bit of a step down in the size of those islands. Before getting into how this reduction in land area has affected the seal population, I wanted to explain a little more about why monk seals need land in the first place. Most importantly, monk seals give birth to their pups and nurse them on land until they wean at 5 to 7 weeks of age. The young pups are not strong swimmers, and they also need to stay safe from sharks. Also, seals of all ages need to rest on land in between their trips to sea where they feed. And then finally, seals molt their fur and skin, usually once a year, and they mostly stay on land while they're doing that. The disappearance of Whaleskate Island in the late 1990s made us wonder whether sea level rise associated with climate change might be a threat to the low-lying islands of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands in general. This was in 2005, and my colleagues Charles Littman and Dave Johnson and we quickly learned that in fact there were no topographic maps of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands available at that time. So in order to do this study, we first had to survey the islands and make some crude maps. And you can see Charles here with a digital theodolite and a GPS mapping one of the islands. So we made what were in fact some pretty crude 3D representations of the islands and then did some simple modeling using projections of sea level rise by 2100 to evaluate whether the islands were in fact vulnerable to sea level rise. And our study did conclude that many of these islands were in fact vulnerable and could go away partially or entirely by the year 2100. But again, we were using some pretty simple models that basically just compared the elevation of the islands to the expected sea level rise, and you would look at how much flooding would occur just based on the sea level rise. And this did not in any way account for things like storms and overwash and high wave events. So it was probably a fairly minimal estimation of the impacts, as we were soon to learn. Here are some pretty dramatic images showing the changes that we've seen in islands at French Frigate Shoals. I already mentioned the disappearance of Whaleskate Island in the 1990s. There's a picture at the top left of what it looked like in 1963, and then again in 2002. And it really disappeared long before 2002, but it emerges every once in a while as a little hump of sand with lots of seals and turtles clustered on it. But nothing really happened other than some more gradual erosion of the remaining islands for the next 20 years or so. But in 2018, we had a really sobering experience in that Trig Island, which had been diminishing over time, eventually just eroded and washed away. So Trig is there in the middle on the left in 2017, and then in 2019, it was all but gone, and it is entirely gone at times. And also in 2018, a more abrupt event happened, Hurricane Walaka, which obliterated East Island, which you can see in the bottom photos. And this was covered quite widely in the news worldwide. So essentially, we went from in the 1990s having Turn Island and these other rather large islands and some smaller spits to having Whaleskate, Trig, and East, the second, third, and fourth largest islands, essentially vaporized and no longer available for seals. So the changes to these islands have had a dramatic impact on the monk seal population, and that's most notable with the effect on the distribution of pupping and the early survival of those pups. And that's what's depicted here. On the x-axis we have the year, and on the y-axis the percentage of pups that are born at each of the islets. And the islets are color-coded here. So what you can see is that all that purple in the lower left is representing Whaleskate Island births, which accounted for more than a quarter of the pups that were born. And there were also many born at East Island during that time. But after Whaleskate disappeared in the late 90s, you can see that pupping really pretty much stopped there. And instead, the mothers went to Trig Island, and that's the blue bars. And as it turns out, Trig was not a great place for females to give birth. And then towards the right side of the graph, you can see that late in the 2018 season is when Trig Island washed away, and thus in 2019, there were very few pups born there. There were still a fair proportion born in 2019 at East Island because there was a little bit of a sand spit left there and there weren't a lot of choices for where the seals could go. But what effect did this have on the seals? Does it matter that they're born on different islands? As it turns out, it did matter, and that's reflected here when we look at the survival of pups from birth to weaning. So remember, the moms are taking care of the pups at that time. The pups are mostly staying on shore, doing a little swimming around in the islands or in the water near their islands when they want, especially when they get a little older. But what we see for the most part throughout this species range is that about 90+% of the pups survive to weaning. But that stopped being the case at French Frigate Shoals, and you can see that here where you start to see this vertical line where it says Whaleskate awash. That's when we started to see the pupping habitat really being diminished at Whaleskate, and we saw a reduction in the survival of those pups, and that was largely due to sharks being able to get them or the seals being washed away. After Whaleskate was completely gone, sort of shifted down to a lower level of survival, sort of around 75% of the pups would survive. And then more recently, in 2018, after Trig and East were inundated, we've seen just about the lowest survival rates ever. So what we can see is that a lot of the pups are dying before they even reach a couple months of age, and that's really not sustainable for the population to recover. The changes in the island habitat has also impacted the distribution of all seals around the atoll, not just the mothers and pups. And that's what's depicted here. It's just like the other graph that I just showed you, but in this case it's all seals and just the frequency with which they spend time on different islands. And that has shifted in a way that is similar to the other plot of mothers and pups, but a little bit less dramatically, because the older seals are kind of less choosy about where they hang out. And this probably really doesn't have a lot of strong survival implications, but it does show a shift nevertheless. So now I want to take a broader view and talk about French Frigate Shoals in the context of the entire northwestern Hawaiian Islands. I suppose that we could imagine that, you know, if there's not enough space at French Frigate Shoals for seals, they could just go to some of the other islands. And one question is whether there's room for them there, and would that really matter to the population or the species as a whole if they were to do that? And so relevant to that question is this graph, which shows the amount of land area at all the individual northwestern Hawaiian Islands, including French Frigate Shoals. And it starts on the left with Curie, then Midway, Pearl and Hermes Reef, Lisiansky Island, Laysan Island, French Frigate Shoals, Necker, and then Nihoa. And the gray bars show the amount of land area at each site. The first thing you notice is that Midway has the most land by far, and then Laysan Island. And then the rest of them are quite a bit smaller. But French Frigate Shoals is really one of the smallest, and Necker and Nihoa are similar, or Nihoa is quite a bit bigger. But in fact, those two islands, Necker and Nihoa, are big rocky islands, and or not even that big islands, but they don't have very much room that the seals can actually use because a lot of it's vertical, cliffy, rocky habitat. So in fact, French Frigate Shoals is probably the third from the smallest in terms of the amount of space for seals to land. So if we're thinking about what limits the populations of seals and could they just go somewhere else, we might want to know whether the amount of space that's available on land limits the size of the population that can live there. And that's a tough question to crack. And the best way we could think of to go about this was to compare the land area of each of the populations against the maximum number of seals that was ever counted there historically, whatever year that was. So what you would maybe expect is if land area was limiting the population size, that there would be a nice relationship where the bigger islands had more seals. But in fact, that's not what we see, and you can see it here on this graph. All of the different populations are abbreviated here, but kind of counterintuitively, Midway has the most land area, as we saw before, but has historically had quite a small seal population. And then you have sort of a scatter in between where Laysan is pretty big and it had a big population, but French Frigate Shoals had the highest count of any place and is one of the smallest in terms of land area. So it really doesn't seem like land area is probably inhibiting population growth, at least historically. And that could be a good sign because it might mean that you don't need very much land at French Frigate Shoals in order to sustain a seal population. Now let's consider foraging habitat as opposed to land habitat as a potential limiter for populations. What I'm showing you here is a map of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and all the blue shaded area are the areas where monk seals forage. They pretty much stick to foraging in waters that are 200 meters and shallower. And so all of the features in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands that meet that criteria of 200 meters or less are shaded here in blue. And I've labeled the location of the various islands and populations along the map. And there's a box around each one of the subpopulations which is color coded the same as the label for the place that the seals land. And it shows the extent of foraging area that is used by seals from each site. And we know about this because for many years we have tracked seals using satellite tags from the different locations, and so we kind of know where they go to forage. And you can see that for one thing, the seals exploit pretty much all the habitat that is available to them that they can reach from their landing areas in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. But the other big take home here that was kind of a surprise to me is that French Frigate Shoals seals use more area than any of the other populations. In fact, seals from French Frigate Shoals utilize 42% of all of the foraging habitat available to monk seals in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So that means that French Frigate Shoals is really critical, because if there were no land there, probably seals from the other sites would not be able to reach that habitat, and it would be unavailable to them. So now this is a comparison just like the one I showed you earlier for terrestrial habitat, but instead it's foraging habitat plotted against the maximum beach count ever recorded. And now we're seeing the relationship that we might have expected. And that is that at French Frigate Shoals, we have the greatest amount of foraging habitat and also the highest populations ever. And in general, there is a relationship where the larger the amount of foraging habitat utilized, the larger the population that can be sustained. In the bottom left here, you see a cluster of these sites that have relatively small amounts of foraging habitat, and the maximum counts at those sites are in fact quite a bit lower. So this does suggest, doesn't prove, but it does suggest that the population size may be limited more by foraging habitat than by terrestrial habitat. And that again could be a good thing, because if there's enough habitat left at French Frigate Shoals for seals to land, have their pups, and rest on, they may be able to sustain themselves there in the longer term. Now let's take another look at what habitat is left at French Frigate Shoals. This is the same graph that I showed you earlier that shows the area of the various islets over time, French Frigate Shoals. Only now I've X'd out the 3 islands that have all but disappeared or entirely disappeared. And the take home from this is that Tern Island is the name of the game. What remains at French Frigate Shoals in terms of land habitat is mostly, in fact, about 80% of it is at Tern Island. So if the seals are going to make their living at French Frigate Shoals in the future, Tern Island is going to play a really important. So then the next question is whether Tern Island really provides enough habitat to sustain a seal population. And we have a clue about this from our old data. This graph shows a series of different panels, each of which is the total counts or the average counts of seals at each of the islands historically. And it's a complicated plot, and you really don't have to look at the whole thing. Focus on the red box there, and that shows the number of seals that were counted on average at Tern Island in the late 80s, early 90s, when the population was quite large. And what you'll see is that there were a lot of seals on the beach there, like 70 plus seals, sometimes on average 90 seals on Tern Island alone. Now that represents more than the total number of seals that are counted at the entire atoll at the present time. So it does suggest that the seals could be accommodated at Tern Island if they needed to be, if there was no place else to land. But there are many caveats to that, because it may be that Tern Island won't provide good enough pupping habitat. We just don't know, because there hasn't been a lot of pups born there yet. And also we know that there are a lot of green sea turtles that want to nest at French Frigate Shoals, and their islands are gone, so they're probably going to be showing up at Tern. And there's a lot of seabirds that are nesting on other islands that are going to be crowding onto Tern. And we just don't know how all of that is going to sort out. But at least this is somewhat encouraging, because it does suggest that Tern Island could accommodate a fairly large number of seals. However, even though maybe the quantity of land habitat at Tern Island is sufficient, it turns out that the quality of the habitat has some really serious issues. So Tern Island was the base, as I mentioned, for the Coast Guard Loran Station, and after that a Fish and Wildlife Service refuge station, and there were buildings there. There's an old seawall there, and over time all of that infrastructure has been degraded and started to fall apart. This was hastened by a couple of really massive storm events, including Hurricane Walaka. And so most of the human structures on the island are now essentially wreckage. And over time, that seawall that has supported the preservation of Tern Island, probably to a large degree, is really in terrible condition, and you can see it in some of the photos here in the top left, for example. It was a double steel seawall, and what happens is that seals, and also turtles and seabirds, by the way, find their way in between parts of this seawall, and they get entrapped in there, and without help, they will die. For most of the last many decades, there have been people stationed at Tern Island that could do patrols and pluck the seals out, and as well as the other animals out of the seawall and save their lives. But now, and for several years, there's only a presence there primarily when our monk seal field camps are out there for a few months a year. And they do rescue the seals, and on the right you can see a weaned pup who has wedged himself under a steel I-beam in the old seawall and really took a lot of work to extract. With the tide rising, it was really quite a nail biter, but our team was able to dig that seal out and get him out. But since 1989, there have been a total of 70 of these cases that we know about because people were there. And it's been getting worse as the wall has deteriorated. And 25 of those 70 were just during 2017 to 2019. So now we're faced with the unfortunate situation that Tern Island is really the last great hope for sustaining a monk seal population. But in fact, the island infrastructure itself is a fatal hazard to the seals. So what can be done about this distressing situation? I think it's best to think about it in different time frames. In the short term, we already know that if we have people on Tern Island, we can do patrols, and when seals get stuck in the seawall, and these are usually weaned pups, we can pull them out and save their lives. And that goes for turtles and seabirds as well. So one solution would be to staff Tern Island, especially during the months of the year that are most important to cover when most of the seals are getting stuck. And then in the middle term, the seawall hazard really needs to be mitigated in some way. I don't know what that solution will be. I imagine it will involve removing the remnants of the old seawall and replacing it with something else that's not hazardous to seals but will help to keep the island intact. In the longer term, finally, I think it's important to consider other options for restoring the other islets at French Frigate Shoals and making them resilient to climate change and sea level rise specifically. Nobody knows the best way to do this yet, but if we're going to preserve the entire northwestern Hawaiian Islands and all of the species that depend upon the terrestrial habitat there, we're going to have to get this right at French Frigate Shoals. Now that's the end of my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So the question answer part is happening right now. So if you guys have any questions, Jason, if you come up, I guess come up on the screen. Anybody can ask any questions they may have. I think someone had a question in the chat box. Let's see. So it's from Rhonda. It says, is land area calculated as monk seal habitat only, or all available land, even if it's not available to seals as habitat?
Yeah, so I answered in the chat box during,
okay.
But it's okay because not everybody maybe read it. But yeah, it's a good question. It was tricky to decide how to do that, but in the end, I just went with the total land area because most of the islands are pretty small and they're pretty flat. A lot of times the seals crawl right across them. So if it was crowded enough, they could probably use most of those islands. if they needed to. The exception are the ones I mentioned, Necker and Nihoa, that have a lot of vertical habitat that seals couldn't use, obviously.
Anybody else have any questions? Floor is open. We have 14 participants. So if you guys have a question, just turn on your mic.
Hi, Jason. This is Rhonda. Super interesting talk and very important for us because we're part of the crew that's going to be up at Sharon Island pretty soon, removing a lot of the debris that's up there. So it's really good to see how important that land area is for the monk seals. And I'm just wondering, aside from all of the rubbish that's up there, is there something else that's keeping seals from that area, or is it just so crowded now because there's so little land area available to all the animals that want to use it at French Frigate Shoals?
It's not really that crowded. There's about 200 and roughly 225 seals at the whole atoll, and they're spread around on the various islands that are left. And there really is quite a lot of room for seals. You know, they're quite spaced out. The biggest issue, you know, the garbage and debris from the hurricanes and stuff up there is an issue, but it's probably not terribly lethal to the seals. But it's really that seawall that's the biggest issue, because that is just a kind of a constant trap. And then anyway, I also just wanted to say thank you guys for going up. I would have said something about your plans to go up there and start doing some mitigation, but I don't know too much about it. So, you know, if there's dead space and nobody else has another question, I'm sure people would be interested to hear about your cruise coming up.
I got a question. So, if those seawalls are causing all those issues with the monk seal, is there any way to possibly remove it, or would that affect, you know, I guess, effects of storms on top of that island?
Yeah, it's a dilemma. There's the seawall, you know, is what has kept the island probably together and kept it from eroding as much as the other ones have. But of course, it's the remainder of that is a threat. Another issue there is that back in the day when the Coast Guard was out there, they used to throw a lot of garbage out there, and it's buried on Turn Island. So there's a lot of contaminants, PCBs and stuff out there, and there's concern with from the EPA folks that if that all started to erode away, that it would cause some problems in the atoll. Of course, the whole island is getting overwashed at times, and it's really leaching out anyway. So I'm not sure how big of an issue that really would be. But ideally, it would be replaced with something that, you know, rock revetment or something like that. That they have replaced a little bit of it around the island about 20 years ago, but something that would be safe for the seals, but would keep the island intact. Cool. It would be expensive and a big engineering require a lot of planning. But of course, the Seabees did it in 1942, and it was a much bigger job then.
It's got to weigh the benefits and. Cool. Anybody else got any questions?
Hi, Jason. It's Vincent, and thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I was just wondering, because you guys have this translocation program, is there any other islands where you can move the population in case that there is nothing that can be done in this specific habitat?
Yeah, there are. We could move some of the seals to other islands, and so the immediate effect of that would be it might save those seals. But there's some problems with that idea. The main one being that really the biggest issue in the long term, if they can't land in that and access that foraging habitat, it takes away, probably about a third of the carrying capacity of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So those seals would be maybe fine that got moved, but the kind of species as a whole would have lost a lot of their habitat. The other thing is that we mostly translocate young animals, especially weaned pups, and those guys, they stick around where you put them. But when you move older animals that kind of already know their way around the world, they often wander off or try to go back to where you took them from. So it might not work for the adults.
Anybody else got any questions? You guys can turn on your mics. Yeah, question.
There was a question in the chat box from Ellen Lubrano, and she asked how important are the Hawaiian Islands, like the Big Island, for monk seal births. And the answer is they're very important. So we call the whole, chain from Niihau east down to the Big Island, the main Hawaiian Islands. And actually, when I started working on monk seals in the late 90s, there were not really very many seals known to be around the main Hawaiian Islands, and the population has really come back. There were some at that time, quite a few at Niihau, but nobody really went out there, so it was kind of a secret. But yeah, so there's probably about 300 seals in all of the main Hawaiian Islands, and the population is growing. So that is likely to be the refuge for the population if all of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands were to go away. But we have some issues in the main Hawaiian Islands. As you read the news out there, you'll see that seals are often getting hooked and drowned in nets. And more recently, we've had the threat of toxoplasmosis, which is a protozoal disease that is introduced because its host is cats, and mostly feral cats. And it's really lethal to monk seals, and we're seeing more and more cases of that. So then the main Hawaiian Islands may not be a panacea for seals.
Anybody else got any questions? Jen, look. Okay. I don't think anybody has any other questions, but if anybody does have any questions, is there a contact email they can contact you at? So after the talk or
Yeah, I'll write it in the chat.
in the chat.
How do I chat to everybody? Well, it's just my name, jason.baker at NOAA.gov, NOAA.gov.
And then if anybody has any questions later on, they can always send us an email to our Hanauma HBA News at Hawaii.edu, and we can relay it to Jason. So if not, nobody else has any questions. Thank you again, Jason, for taking time. It's a very interesting talk, and this will actually be posted on our Hanauma Talks YouTube channel. So I will send you the link, and you can share it with anybody that's interested. So it will be there.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and thanks for your good questions.
Thank you. Aloha.